The primary lymphoid organ is the organ where the lymphocyte undergoes the maturation process. For B cells, the primary lymphoid organ is the red bone marrow. For T cells, the primary lymphoid organ will be the thymus. During the maturation process, two things will occur. The lymphocyte will become immunocompetent. In other words, it will become competent to be able to recognize and bind with its specific antigen. How does this occur? Lymphocytes will display receptors, and remember, receptors are proteins, for the antigens. On the T cells, those receptors are the TCRs, or T cell receptors, and on the B cells, they are the BCRs, or B cell receptors. These proteins have specific shapes with binding sites for one particular antigen usually. This allows that lymphocyte to only recognize that specific antigen and be activated by it. Once the lymphocyte expresses or displays these receptors, it is committed to only binding with a specific antigen. Maturation also involves the lymphocyte becoming self-tolerant. This is important because this will prevent the development of autoimmune diseases. The term auto means self, so an autoimmune disease is a disease where your lymphocytes or your immune system attacks your own cells. During this process of self-tolerance, lymphocytes that mistake self-antigens for non-self antigens are removed from the population. They undergo cell suicide. And this is called apoptosis. Self-tolerance involves positive selection and negative selection. During positive selection, T cells must be able to recognize the MHCs on your body cells. On the left, this cell here is a cell in your thymus. This is an MHC. Remember, MHCs are unique to you unless you are an identical twin. And the structure of the MHC is genetically determined. It is a protein. The thymic cell with the MHC self-antigen complex displays this to the T lymphocyte that is undergoing the maturation process, which is the blue cell. This here is the T cell receptor. The T cell receptor must be able to bind, and that's the recognition, with the MHC on your body's cells. In this case, you'll notice that it isn't able to bind. It doesn't fit. They should fit like a puzzle. Because this T cell has failed to recognize your body's MHC, this cell must undergo cell suicide, apoptosis. So it's going to kill itself and be eliminated from the population and will not go any further in the maturation process. If we look at the cell down at the bottom, the thymic cell is displaying or presenting the MHC to the T lymphocyte undergoing the maturation process. Now notice here that there is a nice fit between the T cell receptor and the MHC. So that means there's a recognition here. This T cell has recognized your body's MHCs. I want to point out something else too. This is the antigen on the MHC. Notice this white area here, there is not a tight binding of the T cell with the antigen. That's important, and I'll explain that to you, why that's important in the next step. So now this T cell will go to the next step, which is negative selection. During negative selection, the thymic cell, remember, presented the MHC with the antigen bound to it to the T cell that's undergoing the maturation process. If the T cell binds tightly with the antigen, what that means is, and this is going to be a self-antigen, if the T cell binds tightly with it, and notice there's not any space, it fits tightly here, then that means that T cell will be activated by this antigen, will begin to divide, and all of the daughter cells will look for that antigen to try to remove it from your body. So this would result in an autoimmune disease, since that is a self-antigen. This cell then will have to undergo apoptosis. It has to be removed from the population because you don't want T cells being activated by self-antigens. That will lead to an autoimmune disease. Here at the bottom, you'll notice this cell passed the first step, the positive selection, because here's the MHC on the thymic cell. Here is the T cell receptor. There is a nice binding and recognition here, but this T cell has not bound tightly with the self-antigen. Notice you've got this little white space here, so that means it is not going to recognize and be activated by a self-antigen. Therefore, this cell will survive and continue the maturation process. Of all of the T cells that undergo this maturation process, only about 2% survive both the positive and the negative selection. So that means a very small percentage of the T cells actually go through the maturation process, survive, and leave the primary lymphoid organ, going to secondary lymphoid organs.